Hello again, guys. Alright, so here we are, slightly different angle, filming at a different time of the day, so there was too much sun on the other side. So now we're over here. Hopefully you can still see me. I think I adjusted it right. But, so part 2 of our little video lecture series. I hope you guys have your timeline sheet out. I'm going to grab mine really quickly. So you should basically always have this whenever we're doing a Civil War day, a Civil War video lecture. Because this, normally if we were in class, I'd have this up, like projected on the whiteboard like I usually do. But since we're not there, I'm just going to have you guys make do with the one you have in front of you. So make sure you have your battle sheet and your timeline in front of you. Awesome. All right. So yesterday, where did we leave off yesterday? Yesterday we left off after the Battle of Shiloh. That's where we stopped yesterday. And today we're going to talk, today's video isn't going to be as long. Oh, yeah, this is my dog. Suki, come say hello. I figure this is the important part, right? This is Suki. She has absolutely no interest in the Civil War whatsoever. Don't you? No, no interest whatsoever. Alright, go take a nap. So she's going to be asleep. Unfortunately, you guys can't because this stuff will be on the quiz. But okay, so yesterday we left off, I think one of the last things I mentioned was the time between different battles and what that meant and what that looked like. So let's open your timeline sheet, which at this point should have 3 entries in it: Sumter, First Bull Run, and Shiloh. So let's look. What's our date for the first Bull Run? Give you guys time to find it. This is what you guys should have. July 21st, 1861, First Battle of Bull Run. Great. And then your next date should be Shiloh, April 6th, 1862. Shiloh. And I briefly mentioned last time, there's a pretty decent amount of time between July of 1861 and April of 1862. I mean, it's almost April now. You know, we're a few weeks out. Think back to what you were doing last July. Last July, I was still in England. So that was a long time ago. A lot can change between these times. And of course, it doesn't mean there hadn't been other, like, you know, skirmishes or incidents in the war between these 2 days. But there hadn't been any big major battles that happened in between. Nothing like, you know, earth-shaking to that extent. And why is that? Well, I mentioned briefly in the last video, a lot of it has to do with the weather. Because these battles are fought obviously outdoors, and the camps where the soldiers at are also outdoors. So in order for the soldiers to be comfortable and to be best prepared for battle, they need to be protected during the colder months. So after the end of summer, sometimes into fall a little bit, but once you start getting to the colder weather, you really don't see much happening in terms of battlefields. Campaigns don't start in the fall because they know they won't be able to continue into the winter once the weather gets bad. They want to instead focus on having stable camps for their soldiers, for them to, like, you know, rest, recuperate, gather supplies, to train and prepare for when the spring thaw comes and battles start once again. So we talked about that a little bit last time. I just want that to be a little refresher, because that way that helps us kind of understand why we have these big gaps of time in between these battles. It's not necessarily that I'm like skipping over stuff that's happening in between. I mean, of course I am. There are, of course, always things happening in between. But the big major points are separated by time because that's how the armies tended to work. Alright, so now that we know that, let's go back to Shiloh where we left off yesterday. So Battle of Shiloh, Grant's army. We know that Grant, working on the third prong of the Anaconda Plan, is fighting on the Mississippi River front, or on the rivers front, we can call it. Because if you'll remember, every time we've learned about a war, which has been multiple times now, so going back to 1812, the Texas War of Independence, the Mexican-American War, all these wars have had fronts. And when I've given you guys handouts, I've made sure to include the list of the fronts on them. So I don't know, hopefully you guys still have some of those. They might come up on future quizzes, but or exams. We're still doing exams. We still haven't quite decided how that's going to work yet. But it's good to know anyway. So it's important to realize that these wars are happening in multiple places, and there are usually very important reasons for why battles are fought on different spots. So I will eventually give you one for the Civil War. But for now, let's just remember Shiloh was fought on the river's front. We can call it that. If you want to note that down on your timeline, so, you know, Shiloh is the river's front. You could, you know, put an R on top of it. Bull Run would be the Potomac front. You could put a P there because that's near around D.C. I think Fort Sumter would be, you know, the ports front, and I'm not exactly sure how the abbreviation works, but if you, that's something you want to indicate, that would be probably something helpful and kind of orientating in your mind, especially since I can't have a huge map in front of me to point you guys towards. But okay, so we spent a little bit of time yesterday on the rivers from Mississippi River, Tennessee River, because remember they fought alongside the Tennessee River at Shiloh. But what's happening now back in the east? What can we go back and think about what's happening on the Potomac River front with the Army of the Potomac, which you'll remember is the main body of the Union Army. So to be completely honest, these 9 months in between Bull Run, which was on the Potomac River front. So remember, Bull Run was fought near Washington, D.C., because you'll remember all the picnickers went out to watch Bull Run. So in the 9 months in between Bull Run and Shiloh, nothing has really happened on the east either, for the same reasons I told you before, weather reasons. But now we're coming up onto the spring. So April of 1862, when Shiloh happens, we start seeing activity happening in the east as well. Because once again, it's seasonal. You can almost think of it as seasonal. So now we're going to switch our focus from the river front to the Potomac front. Write that up here. I'm going to give you a second if you have questions about the logistics of this. It's always difficult to explain the where of wars, in my opinion. That's always something that's difficult for me to understand, where something's happening. And that's hang on a second. She knows she's been bad, don't you? You're not supposed to be barking at other dogs when I'm filming. Are you ashamed? She's very ashamed, clearly. Okay. She's been exiled from the window now. Alright. Where was I? Okay, Potomac front. I was letting you guys write down potential questions about that. Hopefully if you have any questions about the where and how this is oriented, we can work them out via Zoom time. If not, great. It means I explained it well, which I really don't think I did, but we can figure that out. All right, so now we're moving to the Potomac front. We're moving back east to think about what's happening with the Army of the Potomac. The main Union Army at this point. So let's think back. What's the last time we heard about the Army of the Potomac? It was the first Battle of Bull Run. And as we know, that battle did not go at all according to plan. It was supposed to be a quick and easy and bloodless victory, and turned out to be chaos, confusion, and lots of lives on both sides lost. It was a disastrous defeat for the Union Army. And after that happened, President Lincoln appointed a new general of the Union Army. And we're going to take a second to talk about this new general, because he becomes an important military as well as political figure. You'll definitely hear his name come up again. And we're going to talk about this new general, General George McClellan. So who was George McClellan? What kind of person was George McClellan? George McClellan asked newspapers to refer to him as the Little Napoleon, which right there, that tells you a lot about McClellan and his opinion of himself. he had plans to make the most powerful army the United States had ever seen. He was very organized. He was very interested in making sure all the details of his army were working out. He worked extensively on how to train them properly. He, wanted to make sure everything was just right and that nothing would go wrong in the structure of his army in battle. If anything, he almost preferred that to actual fighting. He preferred preparing his army for fighting. But when the time came for actually engaging in battle, he often choked. He often stopped and didn't necessarily attack when he should have. So as far as strategy went, he was very much lacking in that department, even though in preparations and organization, he was extremely talented, which is part of the reason why Lincoln made him general. However, Lincoln didn't realize until later that he lacked the important piece of strategy that makes a general an amazing general. So he spent a long time preparing his army, 9 months, basically, from the first Battle of Bull Run, until April of 1862, March, April-ish, springtime anyway. It got to the point that Lincoln was so impatient with McClellan, because remember, this is near DC, so Lincoln can see firsthand and communicate directly with McClellan about the army, and Lincoln is starting to get impatient. So he actually takes his role as commander-in-chief, of the army, as a president of the United States, and he orders McClellan to attack. Doesn't care how, doesn't care why, when, he just needs to attack the Confederates in some way or another. Okay, fine. So this is the Army of the Potomac. According to the Anaconda Plan, what's the duty of the Army of the Potomac? Remember, they're part of the first prong. So the first prong, the Army of the Potomac, is to defend D.C. and put pressure on Richmond. So that's what McClellan starts to do. If he's going to attack someone, it's going to be Richmond. So in March of 1862, McClellan begins to move his forces down the Potomac River to Richmond. This isn't going to necessarily be a battle that's going to go on your sheet, I don't think. Let me see. Yeah, no, it is not. This is just going to be a small skirmish, so don't worry about writing anything down. Don't worry about dates. This is just more to give us an idea of McClellan and who he was as a general. So March of 1862, a month before Grant's forces meet the Confederates at Shiloh, miles and miles away in Mississippi, in Tennessee, rather. McClellan starts moving his forces to Richmond. The Confederates, especially the ones living in Richmond, can hear from, they can even see in some ways, the Union Army approaching the city. So the inhabitants start fleeing because they think this is it, this is over. The Union is finally attacking our capital. And it almost looks like it's perfect timing for McClellan to attack. However, like we said before, he's organized, he's precise, but he has no strategy and he has no aggression. So he hesitates before he attacks because he's not sure. And that hesitation costs him the victory because he hesitates too long, even though he could have had the city, and he hesitates just outside of the city. And eventually, Confederate forces on their way to defend Richmond attack McClellan's troops along a river called, I wrote this down because I thought it was a funny name, the Chickahominy River. This is not something important for you to remember, I just think it's a funny name. Which was only 6 miles away from Richmond. Both sides took heavy casualties. It was just a skirmish, it wasn't an official battle. But at the end of the day, McClellan was forced to retreat from Richmond in order to prevent more of his men being lost. So he 100% had the upper hand, and he completely refused to take it. He hesitated. And that lost them the potential of ending the war, because if he had taken Richmond, the capital, it's kind of like capturing the flag. You capture the enemy's flag, you won. Capture the enemy's capital, you've taken their government. And of course, Lincoln was furious. Because remember, he had to order him to attack to begin with. And now that he finally did, all he basically did was move his troops somewhere else, and he still didn't attack. So he almost pretty much disobeyed Lincoln's direct orders. So that's a problem. And Lincoln begins to realize how big of a problem this is. And starts thinking that he's going to need a new general. He doesn't necessarily pick one yet, but this is when he first begins to realize, after the failed attack on Richmond in March of 62, that the Union Army is not going to win any wars if they're being led by McClellan. And he and McClellan become rivals, particularly after this incident. And McClellan, the reason why we are spending a little time discussing McClellan and who he is is that later, when Lincoln runs for president again in 64, McClellan is going to run against him. So he'll appear again, this time on the political, not on the military field, and he will continue to be a rival of Lincoln's for many years to come. So there we have a failed attack on Richmond, unfortunately. And this is going to become a theme throughout the Civil War. Because what's the theme we talked about yesterday, our first theme? Does anyone remember? I wasn't super specific about it, so if you don't, that's fine. One of the things I said yesterday as a theme of the Civil War is when one of the sides wins a battle, they often don't pursue post the battle. They kind of just let the enemy disappear, rest, recuperate, and then are able to come back. So that's part of the reason why the war drags on longer. And this is another theme. Lincoln looking for new generals. And it's such a big part of the Civil War. I'm actually going to write it down. Because Lincoln just seems to have a lot of bad luck finding generals. And by generals, I don't necessarily mean, like, there are multiple generals in the army. At this point, we have McClellan, we have Grant, we have other Union generals. But I'm talking about the commander-in-chief, the head general, like Winfield Scott was during the Mexican-American War. I'm talking about the main general. And right now, that's McClellan. But as we know, Lincoln's having second thoughts about that. So he's going to go through several different names, several different generals before he reaches on the one that helps end the war. Some of you may know who that is, or you may have an idea of who that is. I won't spoil it yet, but the important thing is that while we won't talk directly about every single one of these generals that Lincoln picks, the important thing is that he does go through so many. And because of that, the Union Army doesn't really have a consistent method of attack. They still generally follow the Anaconda Plan proposed by Scott, but every general has a different way of leading their troops, so switching from one to another kind of cripples the Union Army in a way that the Confederate Army does not have. Because around the same time that Lincoln is starting to think, maybe I can't have McClellan as my general anymore, the Confederacy switches their command over to a name we've all probably heard before. So the Confederacy switches the commander-in-chief position of their army to General Robert E. Lee. So he officially takes control of the Confederate Army in 1862. He didn't start out as its commander-in-chief, but he takes control. And unlike the Union Army, which, like I just said, switches generals multiple times, the Confederacy remains under the leadership of Robert E. Lee for the rest of the duration of the war. And what do we know about Robert E. Lee? We're not going to go entirely into his history, but if you'll remember, he also fought in the Mexican-American War, alongside people like Winfield Scott, Ulysses Grant, Jefferson Davis, these other names that we keep hearing. And he was a very successful soldier in the Mexican-American War, to the point that Winfield Scott calls him the very best soldier that Scott had ever seen in the field before. So he was incredibly talented. He was precise, he was organized, but he also had great strategy, and he wasn't afraid of being aggressive when he made his attacks. And we're going to see that in the next thing we're going to talk about today. Someone once described Lee as silent, inscrutable, and strong, a daring strategist who did not shy away from aggressive attacks. Without Lee's military expertise and aggressive battle strategies, a lot of historians think that the war probably would have gone very differently. And fun fact, his father was actually an officer during the American Revolution. So once again, you see a lot of these ties these people had, which makes them fighting for the Confederacy and for the split of the Union that much more complicated. But okay, so now Robert E. Lee has taken command of the Confederate Army. McClellan is still in charge of the Union Army, but Lincoln is starting to have second thoughts about that. And the next battle that's fought is where Lincoln finally decides, it's over for McClellan, I need to find somebody new. So what is it about this battle, this next battle that we're going to talk about? So prep your sheets. We're going to write 2 battles today. 2 more. So what is it about these next 2 battles that make Lincoln sack McClellan, basically? Alright, so So let's move ourselves down to July of 1862. July of 1862. This is about 3-4 months following Shiloh, 3-4 months following McClellan's failed campaign to Richmond. And this is a full year after the first Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the Civil War. And it's fitting because on, let me double check my date, in the end of July, early August of 1862, we actually have, and I told you there's a reason why I called it the first Battle of Bull Run, we have the second Battle of Bull Run. And so if you want the date to put down on your sheet, so this should go in your fourth bubble down here, it is August 28th. August 28th of 18... Is it August 28th? No, I actually think... I don't know. My date is wrong. Just put August. Don't put a date for now. I think it was end of July, early August, if I remember correctly, because finding a start date for battle is sometimes difficult. These dates are somewhat arbitrary. I just have them so we have an idea. But just put August 1862 for now. Union and Confederate forces meet at the same location, Bull Run again. And why are they in the same spot? Does anyone have any idea why they're at the same spot? Just think about it. Sorry, the phone fell and I had to fix it. Hopefully that gave you time to think about the question I asked. So, why? Why do you think they're still at the same area of Bull Run? Well, once again, I'm going to always reference this. Anaconda Plan. Army of the Potomac. Remember, that's the army we're dealing with now. These aren't Grant's forces. These are McClellan's forces. And if they're the first part of the plan, they are supposed to stay in the D.C. area. So unlike Grant, who is pushing the Confederates down into Mississippi, who is actively taking territory, the Army of the Potomac has a different job. They just need to hold territory. They don't need to get more. They just need to hold the territory that they have. Which is why we have another battle happening in the same place. Because they're not necessarily trying to go anywhere. Nowhere beyond Richmond, anyway. They should be trying to go to Richmond. But they aren't supposed to be moving anywhere further than that. So this is why we meet again in August of 1862, a year later, at Bull Run another time. The difference this time is that Lee is leading the Confederacy. So what differentiates second Bull Run from first Bull Run? What happens differently this time? Well, unlike the first battle, where both sides fled the battlefield following it, this time the Confederates have a clear and sensational victory. There is left no doubt that the Confederates win the second battle of Bull Run. It's important to mention this battle too because this is the first battle where Lee, newly appointed general, takes the lead and gets a chance to exercise some of his military strategies. One soldier writes home following this battle that General Lee stands now above all generals in modern history. Our men will follow him to the end. And as it turns out, what the soldier says ends up being true. So we're not going to spend any more time talking about second Bull Run. I just want it on your sheet so you know we have 1 and 2. And the important thing to remember is this is Lee's first major battle. And unlike the Confederate general before him, who was at Bull Run, who retreated with his forces, Lee wants to push on past Bull Run. He's not content with just defending, which remember has been the Confederate strategy up till now. He wants to take more territory. He wants to get more ground for the Confederacy. So he decides that he wants to move on to Maryland. Now you may not remember. You might remember that we talked about border states. Does anyone remember what a border state was? Some of you had ideas before. And a border state, most plainly, was a state that took a little while to decide whether they were going to be in the Union or in the Confederacy. So Maryland is one of those border states. And although it ended up siding with the Union, they have a lot of Confederate supporters there. So after winning at Bull Run and having a decisive victory, Lee decides that he wants to push into Maryland. Because he thinks if he does that, he can take advantage of the Confederate support there. Win the state for the Confederacy and push the Union Army away from Richmond. Because the further they get from Richmond, the harder it'll be for them to be able to take Richmond and bring an end to the war. So this is Lee's strategy, his campaign into Maryland. Okay. pushing on past Bull Run. So Bull Run is in August, early August. By September, about a month after Bull Run-ish, Lee starts moving his army into Maryland. So it takes some time to plan and prepare, and then he's on his way to Maryland. He has about 40,000 troops, and he also has heard about McClellan and his timid nature at this point. He's fought against him at Bull Run. So he decides at this point that there's a good chance he can take Maryland if he just has to fight McClellan. So let's see. Number of troops, around 40,000. He's marching them, on foot through Maryland. And there are a lot of accounts of people who saw the armies go by. Even though the Confederacy at this point had just won a victory at Bull Run, they're still not in the best shape. They're a bit war-torn. They're a bit ragged at this point. And a lot of people said it was it was sad almost to watch them because they were in such bad shape at this point. So they're on their way to take Maryland. And they end up meeting Union forces. So Union forces are out there, coming to meet them. And they meet them at a place, and this is what you're going to end up writing on your sheet. At a place called Antietam Creek, near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. And the battle that's fought here becomes known as the Battle of Antietam. So if you can, this should go on the 5th block, the 3rd one at the top. September 17th is going to be the official date of this battle. September 17th, 1862, the Battle of Antietam. So what happens at Antietam? A lot of luck, to be completely honest. A lot of luck is what happens at Antietam. Because by a stroke of luck, Union soldiers actually find the Confederate plans, handwritten, like a copy that a soldier had jotted down clearly for memory purpose, and then wrapped around 3 cigars, and just dropped it by accident, fell out of a soldier's pocket. And the Union soldiers find it, and they know Lee's plans now. So McClellan has the upper hand at Antietam. He knows exactly what Lee is going to do, and you'd think that would give him the confidence to attack, if anything would. But unfortunately, it still does not. He still hesitates for a very long time. And remember, Lee has just returned from marching miles into Maryland, so his army, we already know, is exhausted. They're weak, they're hungry, and they haven't had really a lot of time to regroup. McClellan now knows their plans. He can see that the army is struggling. It would have been a perfect time for him to attack, and he probably would have won. However, he still hesitates, and while he's hesitating, Lee has time to kind of pull his men together, give them some time to rest, regroup, reorganize, and re-strategize. And even though McClellan is the first one to attack, he waited too long, and Lee's army was ready when he attacks. And also it's important to point out McClellan vastly outnumbered Lee as well. So I wrote down a second ago that Lee had 40,000 men. McClellan had over 100,000. So he already has like 60,000 more men than Lee does, and he's still afraid to attack. And this is probably the reason why Lincoln was so frustrated with McClellan. But all right. So the Union Army does eventually, after too long a wait, attack Lee's army. And for this purpose, I'm going to quickly write down these army names as well, because you will hear them. We already know that the Union Army stationed around D.C. is called the Army of the Potomac. And then Lee's army, so Lee's main forces, so the main force of the Confederacy is known as the Army of Northern Virginia at this point. And those are important names to remember because I'm going to refer to them as this. So when you hear, Army of the Potomac, you should think major Union forces near D.C. Army of Northern Virginia, you should think the major Confederate forces near Northern Virginia and D.C., commanded by Lee, because Lee commands the Army of Northern Virginia. So that's our little side note before we get into what actually happens at Antietam. So McClellan eventually orders his forces to attack Lee and his forces. And they start putting repeated attacks. So they attack, they pull back, they attack again, they pull back. They just continue doing this for over 14 hours, just continually plummeting the Confederate forces. And like we said, I think I said in that last video, that Shiloh was the worst thing they'd ever seen, the worst battle they'd ever seen so far. The worst battle most of these people had ever seen in their entire lives. Antietam was now the worst one up to this point. Testimonies from Union soldiers after the battle said that they just saw hundreds of dead bodies littered around. It was a little gruesome to think about. But Antietam is now recognized as probably the bloodiest battle of the Civil War ever. So we'll still hear about bad battles after this. They don't exactly get better, but none of them are ever as bad as Antietam. So after those 14 hours of assault by the Union Army, the Confederate Army is tired, they're battered, bruised, waiting, and they're waiting because they expect the Union Army is going to come at them again. Because they've been going at them for hours and hours. They think they're going to come and finish what they've started, and this could be the beginning of the end for them, they think. But in typical McClellan style, he doesn't pursue them. He finally gets the nerve to attack, but he doesn't have the nerve to finish. But then again, to be fair, a lot of generals before him hadn't either. So he gives Lee and his army the opportunity. At this point, it's late in the night. There's fog, a drizzling rain. Testimonies have told us Lee and his men kind of disappear. They recross the Potomac River back into Virginia, and they retreat from Maryland. So their Maryland campaign has effectively failed. Technically speaking, the battle was a draw. So in your sheet, instead of a capital C or U, put a capital D. December 17th, 1862, Antietam, a capital. So I really need to get a better way to hold my phone up there. But don't worry, I have a mini tripod coming in on Friday, so we won't have consistent phones falling from now on. But anyway, we're almost good for today anyway. Okay, so what I was saying was you should put a D in your little Battle of Antietam Square, because this battle was technically a draw, and it was fought on the Potomac River front. But even though it was a draw, Lee's campaign into Maryland did technically fail. So he doesn't advance forward at any other point throughout the war. He retreats back into Virginia. Twice as many men were killed at Antietam than they were at Shiloh. So this is over 20,000 men combined were killed, and then almost the same amount were wounded or missing in action. So we're looking at incredible loss of life on both sides for a battle that doesn't even have a clear winner at the end. It doesn't really seem to have accomplished much more than sending Lee back from Maryland. And so Lincoln was happy about that. President Lincoln was happy with McClellan that he had driven Lee out of Maryland. But he was not at all happy that McClellan hadn't taken the opportunity to chase Lee's troops as they were already, exhausted from the battle. He thought McClellan should have chased him and potentially brought an end to the war that way. Just finish off the army, go into Richmond now that we didn't have the Army of Northern Virginia to defend it, and effectively end the war, especially after we had lost so much lives already at this battle. And it's after Antietam that Lincoln finally decides that enough is enough, and he fires McClellan officially from the commander of the Army of the Potomac and moves him to a recruitment job in New Jersey. McClellan never commands troops again, although he becomes involved in politics later, as I mentioned before, when he runs against Lincoln in the 1864 election. But we'll talk about that more when we get to there. So, in conclusion, before we stop for today, because we have talked about, what did we talk about? We talked about McClellan. We talked about McClellan's failed campaign on Richmond. We talked about Lee and how he took command over the Confederate Army, the Army of Northern Virginia. We talked about the Second Battle of Bull Run and why they're fighting in the same spot, because they're just staying in D.C. They're not moving like the other armies are. And how, Lee being commander of the Confederate Army changes the outlook of the war, and he's a lot more of an aggressive leader. So he wins decisively at Bull Run, and then moves forward into Maryland, which is when we get Antietam. But unfortunately, Lee is defeated. In a sense, at least he is forced to retreat back to Virginia. McClellan is fired, as I just said, and that's kind of where we're going to stop for today before we move on. So while the Battle of Antietam was unbelievably bloody, the fact that it completely defeated the Army of Northern Virginia, or at least it turned them back into Virginia, was a boost in morale for the North, because up till this point, the Confederacy had been winning, or they had at least been successful in taking a lot of Union lives. So this little boost in morale of physically driving the Confederates out of the Union territory was what was needed for the North to kind of be ready. Okay, I'm going to move forward now. It also got Lincoln thinking about potential other ways to move towards the ends of the war. Other ways that didn't necessarily involve battlefields. And what those ways were, and what they accomplished, and what they meant, is what we're going to talk about in the next video. Or hopefully my phone won't fall twice off the stack of books I have it on, because that's where I am right now. But alright, so that's the end of this video. By this point, you should have 5 squares filled. You should have Bull Run. You should have Antietam in your sheet. And if you look here, see if I can move a little closer. Antietam is down here. Bull Run is the site of 2 battles, is right below it. So they're fairly close to each other, and that's where the area we're dealing with today. This, the Potomac front, the port side front, and the rivers front. Awesome. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, write them down now in preparation for our next Zoom Q&A for our next quiz, whenever that is. I haven't quite decided, but maybe by now you already know. Okay, awesome. So I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.